Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you follow geopolitics, you definitely know this area. But honestly, the sheer scale of its fragility is constantly underestimated. We are talking about a narrow, incredibly powerful global choke point that connects the Middle East to the rest of the world. Surrounded by heavily armed nations, this specific stretch of water is exactly where the deepest tensions between the United States and Iran play out. So let's dive right in.
So why can a conflict happening thousands of miles away actually affect countries all around the globe? It's really easy to look at localized tension between the US and Iran and just assume it stays local. But how did a regional confrontation become so intimately tied to the literal arteries of international trade? We're going to unpack how a spark in this exact location doesn't just create local ripples, it creates massive, undeniable global shockwaves.
Chapter 1. The Narrow Global Bottleneck. Right off the bat, we've got to look at the geography itself. Because here, the geography is actually an immensely powerful actor in the conflict.
There is a quote from the source material that hits the nail on the head, a piece that feels less like an ending and more like a countdown. That captures the fragile reality of this region perfectly. The relationship between Iran and the US has been shaped by literally decades of profound mistrust. Sure, at various moments diplomacy has created pauses in the fighting, but a ceasefire might stop missiles. It definitely doesn't stop the mistrust. Both sides just wait, both sides watch, the weapons stop, but the tension is completely still there. It creates this strange kind of peace, one that isn't really an ending at all, but rather a countdown to the next potential event.
And this physical geography brilliantly illustrates why that countdown matters so much. If we look away from the missiles for a second and just look at the map, we see the Strait of Hormuz connecting the Persian Gulf to the wider ocean. Get this, every single day, roughly 1/5 the world's total global oil consumption passes through these dark waters. This tiny strait is literally an artery for global survival. And a crisis here? It doesn't even need to become a total blockade to create panic. Just the mere uncertainty of a conflict is enough to threaten that lifeline.
Chapter 2. The Logic of Deterrence. Let's transition over to the geopolitical chessboard and unpack the delicate calculations both the US and Iran are constantly making behind closed doors. We hear the word deterrence thrown around a lot. Basically, it's a strategy where each side wants the other to believe that escalation will become just way too expensive to pursue. But here's the catch. Deterrence relies entirely on clear communication. And as we all know, communication easily breaks down during times of conflict. One side issues a warning, but the other side sees it as a threat. One side thinks they're playing defense, the other sees flat-out aggression. This is exactly where miscalculations turn incredibly dangerous.
So the crucial takeaway here is understanding the mirror image dilemmas both nations face. For the United States, the calculation is a total tightrope walk. If attacks on their forces or shipping receive no response, they risk appearing completely unable to protect their interests. But if they respond too powerfully, the conflict expands. And on the flip side, Iran faces a remarkably similar dilemma. If they refuse to respond to military pressure, they risk appearing weak. But if they hit back too forcefully, they invite a much stronger reaction. Both sides are trapped in this high-stakes balancing act, where they can't look weak, but they absolutely cannot afford to spark a wider war.
Chapter 3. Ships in the Crossfire. What actually happens when this intense military posturing in a narrow geographic bottleneck inevitably spills over into commercial shipping?
The second commercial shipping gets dragged into this, the entire nature of the crisis changes. Think about it. A military base is part of a military confrontation. But commercial vessels? They have international crews, they carry foreign cargo, they connect distant economies that have absolutely nothing to do with the original dispute. Because of this, a single incident at sea creates simultaneous pressure in multiple capitals worldwide. The military sees a threat, the shipping company sees financial risk, and the rest of the world, well, they see economic uncertainty.
Chapter 4. The Cycle of Retaliation. Let's map out the anatomy of an escalation, walking step by step through how a single spark snowballs into something massive.
This is without a doubt the most dangerous pattern in the conflict. It's not really the initial attack, it's the unstoppable loop that follows. Step 1, an attack. Step 2, retaliation. Step 3, justification. And finally, Step 4, the next escalation. One side strikes, the other responds. The first side says the response was expected, while the second side claims it was totally necessary. Then another strike follows. Soon enough, every single action is justified as a reaction to something that happened before. Nobody actually believes they are the ones starting the next escalation. This cycle of retaliation quickly becomes stronger and way more powerful than either side's original plan.
Chapter 5: The Global Ripple Effect. Now, let's expand our focus outward to the macro level and map out how this unstoppable loop in one single strait impacts the entire world.
A localized military threat physically alters global supply chains. It's a domino effect. If shipping becomes dangerous, companies have to calculate new risks. Higher risks? That means rising insurance costs. To avoid the danger altogether, shipping routes are changed, which suddenly makes transportation much, much more expensive. And when the cost of moving energy and goods goes up, that economic pressure travels far beyond the Middle East. It hits consumers globally in very real ways, triggering spikes in inflation, causing sudden delays in shipments of electronics, and, you guessed it, sending gas prices skyrocketing overnight.
The battlefield essentially becomes a network. Modern conflict does not have a single, isolated battlefield anymore. Regional conflicts like this simply cannot be contained. A military action in Hormuz affects a shipping route, which then disrupts energy markets, which creates an economic shock, which then produces entirely new political pressures in capitals all around the world. Everything is interconnected.
But as we look at these vast geopolitical networks, we have to ground the abstract theory in the human reality. There's a profound thought here. Maps cannot show everything. They cannot show the fear of a parent asking whether the next day will be normal. Maps can show us shipping routes and military zones, sure, but they don't show the sailors looking at an uncertain horizon, the soldiers far from home, or the civilians trapped in the crossfire. Wars are so often described with clinical words like deterrence and strategic pressure, but ordinary people? They experience it as disruption, fear, and that constant, lingering question of whether tomorrow will just be a normal day. Chapter 6: Diplomacy versus Escalation. This brings us to a huge paradox in modern geopolitics. How do countries prepare for confrontation while simultaneously searching for an exit? It might seem completely contradictory, but even during military escalation, diplomacy continues in the background. Military pressure is used to create leverage, while diplomacy is used to find an exit. Both sides are basically moving in two directions at once. They are intentionally launching strikes to build their negotiation power, while at the exact same time looking for a diplomatic off-ramp to avoid a total, all-out war.
The problem is, every new attack makes diplomacy more difficult. That window for an off-ramp is constantly shrinking. Every casualty and every retaliation creates fresh anger and new political demands back home. Slowly but surely, the space for compromise gets squeezed. The door to negotiation might technically still exist, but walking through it becomes exponentially harder because the conflict destroys the single most vital resource for diplomacy: trust.
So, looking ahead, the sources point to three possible futures. First, continued escalation, meaning more strikes and even more pressure on global shipping. Second, a prolonged stalemate, where neither side really wins or stops and the conflict just grinds on in exhausting waves. Or third, a very difficult diplomatic negotiation requiring that incredibly rare resource we just talked about: trust. It's super important to note here that these futures won't just be decided by whoever has the biggest military. They're going to be decided by economic endurance and domestic political pressure.
You know, the most dangerous wars aren't always the ones that start with some grand, sweeping plan for total destruction. Sometimes they begin with a limited objective, just a warning, a single retaliation, a response, and then another response. Eventually, the original goal gets entirely lost in the fog, and the conflict grows dangerously beyond its origins. And that right there is exactly why the world's focus remains so intensely fixed on the dark waters of Hormuz.
So I want to leave you with this to think about. Will the Strait of Hormuz become the place where this conflict inevitably expands into a full-blown global crisis? Or could it, ultimately, become the place where both sides finally realize that escalation has reached its absolute limit? The answer is still unknown, and the next chapter is completely unwritten. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped you see the hidden story behind the headlines.